The turquoise waters of Eagle Beach shimmered under the Caribbean sun on May 30th, 2005. Paradise, they called it. A place where worries dissolved like sugar in rum punch, where college graduates celebrated their freedom before the real world came knocking. And for 18-year-old Ashley Brennan from Mountain Brook, Alabama, this was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. On a graduation gift from her parents, David and Patricia Brennan. 10 days in Aruba with her two best friends, celebrating the end of high school and the beginning of everything else. Nobody could have predicted that Ashley would never make it home. The Brennan family had money. David owned 3 successful car dealerships across Birmingham, and Patricia ran a boutique interior design firm that catered to the city's elite. They lived in a sprawling colonial on Shades Mountain, complete with a circular drive and manicured gardens that Patricia tended to like precious children. Ashley was their only child, born after years of fertility struggles, and they had poured their love and resources into giving her every advantage. Ashley wasn't spoiled, though. She had earned a partial scholarship to Auburn University for journalism, but maintaining a 3.8 GPA while volunteering at the local animal shelter and writing for the school newspaper. Her friends, Kayla Martinez and Jessica Webb, had been her constant companions since middle school. The 3 were inseparable, planning this Aruba trip for over a year, saving money from part-time jobs and babysitting gigs. The girls arrived at Queen Beatrix International Airport on May 28, 2005, giddy with excitement and armed with disposable cameras. They checked into the Holiday Inn Sunspree Resort, a mid-range hotel that offered the perfect balance of fun and safety for 3 teenagers on their own for the first time. The resort sat along the famous Palm Beach Strip, where white sand met crystal-clear water, and the most dangerous thing seemed to be getting a sunburn. For the first 2 days, everything went according to plan. The girls spent their time lounging by the pool, snorkeling in the shallow reefs, and exploring the colorful streets of Oranjestad. They took hundreds of photos, bought matching shell bracelets from a local vendor, and stayed up late giggling about boys and college plans. Ashley called her parents every evening at exactly 6 p.m., just as she had promised. "Mom, you would love it here," Ashley gushed during her May 29th call, her voice crackling through the international connection. "The sunsets are incredible, and the people are so friendly. Kayla got her hair braided today, and she looks like a mermaid. We are going to Carlos and Charlie's tonight for dinner. Don't worry, we are being super careful." Patricia Brennan smiled as she listened to her daughter's excitement. She had worried about letting Ashley go so far from home, but David had convinced her it was time to give their daughter some independence. "Just promise me you will stick together," Patricia said, "and don't talk to strangers." "Mum, everyone here is a stranger," Ashley laughed. "But we are fine. I promise. Love you." That would be the last time Patricia Brennan heard her daughter's voice. May 30th dawned bright and cloudless, another perfect day in paradise. The girls had planned a full itinerary, breakfast at the resort, a shopping trip to the Renaissance Marketplace, and then an afternoon at Eagle Beach, that consistently ranked as one of the world's most beautiful beaches. They were supposed to meet up with some college guys from Georgia they had met at the hotel bar the night before. But when Kayla Martinez woke up that Monday morning, Ashley's bed was empty. At first, Kayla wasn't concerned. Ashley was an early riser, often going for walks on the beach or hitting the hotel gym before her friends were awake. But when 9 a.m. came and went with no sign of Ashley, worry began to creep in. Jessica checked the bathroom, the balcony, even the ice machine down the hall. Nothing. Nothing. The hotel staff was initially dismissive. Young tourists wandering off wasn't uncommon, especially after a night of drinking. Maybe she had met someone. Maybe she was sleeping it off somewhere else. The girls insisted that wasn't like Ashley, but the front desk clerk, a tired-looking woman named Maria Santos, just shrugged. "Give it until tonight," she said in accented English. "Then she will come back." But Ashley didn't come back. By 6 p.m., when Ashley failed to make her daily call home, Kayla and Jessica were in full panic mode. They had spent the day combing the resort, the beach, every bar and restaurant they had visited. They had shown Ashley's photo to dozens of people. Some remembered seeing her, but the details were vague and conflicting. A bartender at Carlos and Charlie's thought he might have served her around midnight. A taxi driver claimed he had given a ride to a girl matching her description, but couldn't remember where he had dropped her off. The girls finally called the police at 7:30 p.m., exactly 12 hours after they last saw Ashley. The Aruban authorities responded with what would later be criticized as a frustrating lack of urgency. Missing person cases involving tourists were complicated, they explained. Jurisdictional issues, diplomatic protocols, the paperwork that needed to be filed in triplicate. Detective Luis Ramirez was assigned to the case. A 20-year veteran of the Aruban police force, Ramirez had handled dozens of missing tourist reports over the years. 95% of them resolved themselves within 48 hours. The young people got drunk, got lost, got distracted. They usually turned up sheepish and apologetic, often with wild stories about their adventures. But something about the Ashley Brennan case felt different from the start. Kayla Martinez was nearly hysterical when she gave her statement. She kept repeating that Ashley would never just disappear, that she was responsible, that she always kept her promises. The girl showed Ramirez text messages on her flip phone, proof that Ashley had been planning to meet them for breakfast at 8 a.m. and her bed hadn't been slept in. Her passport, money and medication were still in the hotel room safe. She has anxiety, Jessica Webb added, her voice shaking. She takes medication for it. She would never go anywhere without her pills. Never. Ramirez dutifully noted these details, but he had heard similar protests before. Parents always insisted their children were responsible. Friends always swore their companions would never do anything risky. The detective had learned to be skeptical of such assurances. The investigation began in earnest on May 31st. Hotel security footage was reviewed, revealing that Ashley had indeed left the resort around 1:30 a.m. on May 30th. And the grainy black and white images showed her walking through the lobby alone, apparently sober and moving with purpose. She was wearing the same clothes her friends remembered, a white sundress, sandals, and the shell bracelet they had bought together. And the footage was frustratingly incomplete. The camera that should have captured her leaving through the main entrance had mysteriously malfunctioned that weekend, showing only static, and the parking lot cameras had similar issues. It was as if Ashley had simply vanished into the tropical night. Back in Alabama, David and Patricia Brennan were living every parent's worst nightmare. The call had come at 3 a.m. their time, jolting them from sleep with news that would shatter their world. Their first instinct was to fly to Aruba immediately, but they were advised to wait, to let the local authorities do their work. "She's probably just having fun," David told his wife, trying to convince himself as much as her. "You know how kids are. She will call any minute, embarrassed about worrying us." But Patricia had a mother's intuition, and it was screaming that something terrible had happened. She spent the next day calling everyone she could think of, the American embassy, their congressman's office, the FBI. Most told her the same thing: wait 48 hours. Give the local police time to work. Don't panic yet. By June 1st, waiting was no longer an option. The Brennans boarded a plane to Aruba, bringing with them a determination that would drive the search for their daughter for years to come. They also brought something else: money and the influence that came with it. David Brennan was not a man accustomed to being told to wait. The couple's arrival in Aruba marked a turning point in the investigation. Suddenly, resources that had been unavailable became accessible. Search teams were organized. Helicopters were dispatched. The FBI sent agents from the Violent Crimes Against Children Unit, operating under a mutual assistance treaty with the Dutch authorities. Agent Rebecca Foster was the lead federal investigator assigned to the case. A 15-year veteran of the Bureau, Foster had worked dozens of missing children cases, from runaway teenagers to stranger abductions. She prided herself on her ability to read people and situations, to separate the wheat from the chaff in investigations that often generated more theories than facts. Foster's first impression of Aruba was that it was a small island where everyone knew everyone else's business. the kind of place where secrets were hard to keep, but where loyalty ran deep and outsiders were viewed with suspicion. The local police were cooperative but territorial, sensitive about American authorities implying they couldn't handle their own cases. The agent's first priority was reconstructing Ashley's final hours. The hotel footage showed her leaving alone at 1:30 a.m., but witness accounts suggested she had been at Carlos and Charlie's until at least midnight. That left a narrow window of time unaccounted for, but it was a crucial one. Carlos and Charlie's was a popular hangout for both tourists and locals, a raucous bar and restaurant that stayed open until 2 a.m. The staff remembered Ashley and her friends from earlier in the evening. They had shared a table with 4 college-age males who appeared to be American tourists. The group had been laughing and dancing, apparently having a great time. But the boys were nowhere to be found. Hotel records showed that 4 young men from the University of Georgia had checked out of the Holiday Inn on May 30th, hours after Ashley disappeared. Their names were Brandon Mills, Tyler Johnson, Kevin Wright, and Drew Patterson. All were from affluent Atlanta suburbs, all were on the dean's list, and all had seemingly vanished as thoroughly as Ashley herself. This discovery electrified the investigation. Finally, there were concrete leads to follow, specific individuals to track down. Foster immediately contacted the FBI field office in Atlanta, requesting assistance in locating and interviewing the 4 students. But when agents arrived at their respective homes, they were met with a wall of silence. The expensive lawyers had been retained. Constitutional rights were invoked. The boys would not be speaking to law enforcement without immunity agreements that prosecutors were not prepared to offer. The silence was as incriminating as it was frustrating. The innocent people generally didn't lawyer up before being asked a single question. The FBI's behavioral analysis unit suggested that at least one of the 4 men knew what had happened to Ashley Brennan, and possibly all of them. Meanwhile, in Aruba, the ground search continued with increasing desperation. The island was only 19 miles long and 6 miles wide, with a population of just over 100,000 people. In theory, there weren't many places to hide a body, but Aruba's landscape was deceiving. Limestone caves honeycombed the northern coast. Dense tropical vegetation covered much of the interior, and the ocean, beautiful and inviting during the day, could swallow secrets without a trace. David Brennan hired his own search teams, private investigators, and even a psychic who claimed to have visions of Ashley trapped in a cave somewhere on the island's windward side. He offered a $250,000 reward for information leading to his daughter's safe return, then doubled it when no credible tips materialized. The local media attention was intense but fleeting. Aruba depended on tourism, and prolonged coverage of a missing American teenager wasn't good for business. The story was quietly discouraged from the front pages, relegated to brief updates that emphasized the ongoing investigation without dwelling on the troubling implications. But American media was a different story entirely. The case had all the elements that made for compelling television: a beautiful young victim, an exotic location, mysterious circumstances, and wealthy parents who refused to give up. Cable news networks descended on the island like vultures, turning the Holiday Inn into a makeshift media center. The coverage was a double-edged sword for the Brennan family. The publicity kept Ashley's case in the public eye and generated thousands of tips, but it also attracted conspiracy theorists, false confessions, and opportunists looking to profit from their tragedy. Patricia Brennan found herself fielding calls from psychics, private investigators of dubious reputation, and tabloid journalists offering money for exclusive interviews. But 3 weeks into the investigation, the first major break appeared to come from an unexpected source. A local fisherman named Carlos Ruiz came forward with information that sent shockwaves through the case. That on the morning of May 30th, he claimed Cora's son. He had been preparing his boat for an early fishing trip when he noticed unusual activity at a secluded beach about 2 miles from the Holiday Inn. 3 or 4 young men, apparently American tourists based on their clothing and behavior, had been dragging something heavy from the shoreline toward a waiting vehicle. Ruiz couldn't make out details in the pre-dawn darkness, but something about the scene had struck him as wrong. The men were clearly in a hurry, constantly looking around as if afraid of being seen. Ruiz admitted he hadn't thought much of it at the time. Tourists did strange things, especially when they were drunk. But after seeing Ashley's photo on the news and hearing about the timeline of her disappearance, he began to wonder if what he had witnessed was connected to her case. Detective Ramirez was initially skeptical. Ruiz had a reputation for drinking and telling tall tales, and his story had conveniently emerged only after the reward money had been announced. But Agent Foster pushed for a thorough investigation of the fishermen's claims, and what they discovered was disturbing. The beach Ruiz described was indeed isolated, accessible only by a poorly maintained dirt road that most tourists would never find. When investigators processed the area, they found evidence of recent activity, tire tracks from at least 2 vehicles, disturbed sand that suggested something heavy had been dragged across it, and most significantly, a small piece of fabric that appeared to match the white sundress Ashley had been wearing. The fabric was shipped to an FBI lab in Quantico for DNA analysis, while investigators began the painstaking process of tracking down every rental car and taxi that might have been in the area during the critical time frame. The University of Georgia students had rented a Jeep Wrangler from Budget on May 28th. The vehicle had been returned on May 30th, shortly before they left the island. When investigators examined the rental records, they discovered something that chilled them to the bone. The Jeep had been returned with over 200 additional miles on the odometer, far more than would be expected from normal tourist activities on a small island. More damning still, the vehicle had been professionally cleaned before being returned, something that struck the rental agency as unusual but not necessarily suspicious at the time. The net was tightening around Brandon Mills, Tyler Johnson, Kevin Wright, and Drew Patterson. But the young men remained safely beyond reach in Georgia, protected by their lawyers and their families' wealth. Extradition would require ironclad evidence, and despite the mounting circumstantial case, prosecutors still lacked the smoking gun they needed. That changed on June 15th, when Patricia Brennan received a phone call that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The caller claimed to be someone who had information about Ashley's fate but was afraid to come forward officially. Speaking in a voice that was clearly disguised, possibly through electronic means, the mysterious informant provided details about the case that had never been made public. Ashley had indeed been at Carlos and Charlie's with the 4 college students, the caller said. There had been an argument, something about Ashley wanting to leave and the boys pressuring her to stay. The situation had escalated when Ashley threatened to report inappropriate behavior to hotel security. That's when things had gotten out of hand. According to the caller, Ashley had been taken to a remote location against her will. What happened next was unclear, but the caller implied that Ashley had been killed, either accidentally or intentionally, and her body disposed of in a way that made discovery unlikely. The most chilling part of the call was the caller's claim that there were photographs and possibly video evidence of what had happened to Ashley. The images were being kept as insurance by one of the participants, but the caller suggested they might be willing to turn over the evidence for the right price. Patricia Brennan was too shocked to ask many questions before the line went dead. She immediately contacted Agent Foster, who arranged for recording equipment to be installed on the Brennans' hotel phone in case the caller contacted them again. The FBI also began analyzing the call, hoping to extract background noise or voice patterns that might help identify the informant. The call was never traced, and the mysterious informant never contacted the Brennans again. But the information provided proved to be disturbingly accurate when cross-referenced with other evidence. The caller had known details about the rental car, about Ashley's last known location, and about inconsistencies in the timeline that investigators had not yet made public. Someone knew exactly what had happened to Ashley Brennan. The question was whether they would ever be willing to tell the truth. As June turned to July, the official investigation began to wind down. The Aruban authorities were under pressure to declare the case closed, to allow their island paradise to return to normal. Tourism was suffering, and influential resort owners were making their displeasure known to government officials. Detective Ramirez found himself caught between his desire for justice and the political realities of his position. He genuinely believed that Ashley Brennan was dead, and that the University of Georgia students were responsible for her death. But belief wasn't evidence, and evidence was what he needed to make arrests that would stick in court. The forensic analysis of the fabric found on the beach was inconclusive. The sample was too small and too degraded by salt water and sun exposure to yield DNA evidence. The tire tracks were generic, matching hundreds of vehicles on the island. Even the suspicious mileage on the rental car could be explained away by enterprising defense attorneys. Agent Foster made one last attempt to crack the case by flying to Atlanta and personally interviewing the families of the 4 suspects. She was met with hostility, expensive lawyers, and polite but firm refusals to cooperate. The boys themselves had scattered to different colleges for the summer, making any attempt at surveillance or pressure tactics extremely difficult. By August 2005, the Ashley Brennan investigation had reached an impasse. The case remained officially open, but active leads had been exhausted. The reward money remained unclaimed. The mysterious informant had vanished as completely as Ashley herself. David and Patricia Brennan refused to accept defeat. They established the Ashley Brennan Foundation, but dedicated to helping families of missing persons navigate the complex international legal systems that often hindered rather than helped such cases. They lobbied for changes in how American authorities handled overseas disappearances. They never stopped searching for their daughter. But as the months turned into years, hope began to fade. Ashley would have graduated from Auburn University in 2009. She would have started her journalism career, perhaps working for a newspaper or television station. She might have gotten married, had children, given her parents the grandchildren they would now never have. Instead, there was only an empty bedroom in Mountain Brook, kept exactly as Ashley had left it on the morning she flew to Aruba. Her diploma from Auburn arrived posthumously in 2009, awarded based on the credits she had earned during her dual enrollment program in high school. Patricia Brennan framed it and hung it above Ashley's desk, next to photos from the Aruba trip that had ended so tragically. The case grew cold, but it never disappeared entirely. Online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries kept Ashley's story alive. Amateur sleuths analyzed every piece of evidence, proposed elaborate theories, and occasionally generated new leads that inevitably led nowhere. The University of Georgia students graduated, started careers, got married, and moved on with their lives. If they carried any guilt about what had happened in Aruba, they showed no outward signs of it. They had clearly decided that silence was their best protection, and for nearly 2 decades, that strategy proved successful. Until 2023, when everything changed. Tyler Johnson had fallen far from his privileged beginnings. A series of bad investments, a messy divorce, and a growing addiction to prescription painkillers had cost him his job as an investment banker and most of his family's money. By the time he was arrested for embezzling funds from his employer's client accounts, he was living in a studio apartment in a rough part of Atlanta, far from the suburban mansion where he had grown up. The embezzlement conviction earned Johnson a 5-year sentence in federal prison, where he found himself surrounded by hardened criminals who had no patience for fallen rich boys. Prison was a brutal awakening for someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions, but it was during his 3rd year behind bars, facing the likelihood of additional charges that could extend his sentence significantly, that Tyler Johnson made a decision that would finally bring answers to the Ashley Brennan case. On March 15, 2023, Patricia Brennan received a package with no return address. Inside was a cheap smartphone and a note written in shaky handwriting, "Mrs. Brennan. I'm sorry for what happened to Ashley. I'm sorry it took me so long to find the courage to tell the truth. Please watch the video on this phone. Your daughter deserved better. I hope this helps you find some peace." The video that changed everything was about to be played for the first time. Patricia Brennan's hands trembled as she held the smartphone. 18 years of grief and unanswered questions suddenly converging into this single moment. The cheap device felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the promise of truth that had eluded her family for nearly 2 decades. She sat in Ashley's preserved bedroom, surrounded by graduation photos and faded memories, and pressed play on the video that would finally reveal her daughter's fate. and the screen flickered to life, showing the gaunt face of Tyler Johnson. Prison had aged him brutally. But the cocky college student who had once vacationed in Aruba was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed man whose expensive upbringing couldn't mask the toll of incarceration and guilt. But he was sitting in what appeared to be a prison visitation room, speaking directly into the camera with a voice that cracked with emotion. "Mrs. Brennan, Mr. Brennan, I know you probably hate me and you have every right to. My name is Tyler Johnson and I was one of the 4 guys who met Ashley at Carlos and Charlie's that night. I have lived with what happened for 18 years, and I can't do it anymore. I can't sleep. I can't look at myself in the mirror. Your daughter didn't deserve what happened to her, and you didn't deserve to spend all these years not knowing the truth." Johnson paused, wiping his eyes with a shaking hand. In the background, the familiar sounds of prison life could be heard, metal doors slamming, muffled conversations, and the constant underlying tension of a place where violence was always just beneath the surface. "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is going to be hard to hear. But Ashley deserves to have her story told, and you deserve to know what really happened to your daughter." The confession that followed was more horrific than anyone had imagined. According to Johnson, the evening had started innocently enough. Ashley, Kayla, and Jessica had been at Carlos and Charlie's celebrating their last night in Aruba. The 4 University of Georgia students had approached their table, drawn by the girls' obvious joy and the infectious energy that Ashley radiated. They had bought drinks, shared stories about college plans, and danced to the reggae music that filled the humid night air. But as the evening progressed, the dynamic began to shift. Brandon Mills, who had emerged as the unofficial leader of their group, became increasingly fixated on Ashley. He was drunk, aggressive, and unused to being turned down by anyone. When Ashley politely declined his increasingly inappropriate advances, Mills saw it as a challenge rather than a rejection. "Brandon wasn't used to hearing no," Johnson continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "His dad owns half of North Georgia, and Brandon grew up thinking he could have whatever he wanted. When Ashley kept turning him down, he got angry. Really angry. That'd come. The situation escalated when Mills began making crude comments about what he wanted to do to Ashley. She had finally had enough and announced that she was returning to the hotel to join her friends, who had left earlier in the evening feeling uncomfortable with Mills' behavior. That's when Mills made the decision that would destroy multiple lives forever. Brandon said we weren't going to let her just walk away like that. He said she needed to learn some respect. Drew and Kevin, they were too drunk to really understand what was happening. I should have stopped it right there. I should have walked away. But I was 20 years old and stupid. And I let Brandon talk me into thinking we were just going to scare her a little." The 4 students had followed Ashley when she left the bar around 1:30 a.m. They caught up with her in the hotel parking lot, where Mills convinced her to get in their rental car by claiming he had something important to tell her about one of her friends. Ashley, trusting and perhaps still slightly intoxicated, had made the fatal mistake of believing him. Instead of taking her back to the hotel, Mills drove toward the remote area of the island where fisherman Carlos Ruiz would later witness their activity. The drive took about 20 minutes, during which Ashley realized she had been deceived and began demanding to be taken back to her hotel. She wasn't scared at first, Johnson remembered, tears now flowing freely down his face. She was angry. She told Brandon she was going to report him to hotel security, that her parents would sue him, that he was making the biggest mistake of his life. She was right about that last part. When they reached the isolated beach, Mills parked the jeep and announced his intentions. He was going to teach Ashley some manners, and the others were going to help him do it. Kevin Wright, the youngest of the group at 19, had sobered up enough to realize how wrong the situation was and tried to intervene. Kevin told Brandon we needed to take her back, that this was crazy. Brandon pulled out a knife he had bought earlier that day from some souvenir shop. He said anyone who tried to stop him was going to regret it. Drew was passed out in the back seat by then, and Kevin backed down. I should have done something. God help me, I should have stopped him. What happened next was a sexual assault that lasted over an hour. Johnson's confession became increasingly difficult to watch as he described Ashley's desperate attempts to escape, her pleas for mercy, and the gradual realization that her attackers weren't going to let her live to tell anyone what had happened. She kept saying she wouldn't tell anyone, that she just wanted to go home to her parents. She talked about her mom and dad, about how worried they would be. She even talked about college, about the stories she wanted to write as a journalist. Brandon just laughed at her. He said she was never going to write any stories. The assault might have ended there, with Ashley traumatized but alive, if not for a moment of recognition that sealed her fate. In her terror and desperation, Ashley had managed to grab Mill's wallet during a struggle, hoping to use it as leverage for her freedom. When she saw his driver's license, she spoke his full name aloud, along with his Atlanta address. Mills realized that Ashley could identify all of them, their faces, their names, their home addresses. Even if she agreed to stay silent, there was no guarantee she would keep that promise once she was safe. The risk was too great. Brandon said we had gone too far to stop now. He said it was our word against hers, and nobody would believe a rich kid from Atlanta would do something like this. But then Kevin pointed out that there were 4 of us and only 1 of her, and that made it look even worse. Brandon got this look in his eyes, and I knew what he was thinking before he said it. Mills made the decision to eliminate the only witness to their crime. He ordered Johnson and Wright to hold Ashley while he strangled her with the belt from her sundress. Drew Patterson, who had finally awakened from his alcohol-induced stupor, tried to stop what was happening but was threatened into submission by Mill's knife. Ashley Brennan died on that remote beach in the pre-dawn hours of May 30th, 2005, fighting for her life until the very end. Her last words, according to Johnson, were an apology to her parents for not being more careful. The 4 young men then faced the horrifying task of disposing of Ashley's body. Mills, displaying a cold calculation that terrified his companions, had apparently thought through various scenarios during their time on the island. He directed them to wrap Ashley in a beach towel they had brought for their earlier swimming excursions and carry her to a limestone cave system about half a mile inland from the beach. Brandon seemed to know exactly where he was going, Johnson recalled. Later, I found out he had been exploring those caves earlier in the week with some local guy he met at a bar. He knew they went deep underground, that some of them connected to underwater channels that led out to sea. The cave Mills had chosen was accessible only through a narrow opening concealed by vegetation. Inside, a vertical shaft dropped nearly 50 feet into darkness. The 4 students lowered Ashley's body into the depths using rope they had brought, ostensibly for water sports but now serving a much darker purpose. We could hear water down there, like an underground river or something. Brandon said the tide would take her out to sea, that she would never be found. He made it sound like we were doing her parents a favor, saving them from having to see what we had done to her. After disposing of Ashley's body, Mills orchestrated an elaborate cover-up that demonstrated a chilling level of premeditation. The group drove to several different locations on the island, creating false trails and alibis. They cleaned the rental car obsessively, disposing of evidence in multiple dumpsters across Aruba, and Mills even had them create fake receipts and credit card charges to support a fabricated timeline of their activities. And most importantly, Mills convinced his companions that their survival depended on absolute silence. He reminded them that they were all equally guilty now, all facing life sentences or even the death penalty if the truth came out. Their best chance was to stick together and maintain their innocence. Brandon made us swear a blood oath, Johnson continued, his voice filled with self-loathing. We cut our hands with his knife and pressed them together, promising never to tell anyone what had happened. He said if any of us ever talked, he would make sure we all went down together. I believed him. I was 20 years old and terrified, and I believed him. The group returned to their hotel, showered, packed their belongings, and checked out as scheduled. They flew back to Atlanta that afternoon, each carrying a secret that would poison the rest of their lives. But Mills wasn't finished. In the weeks that followed Ashley's disappearance, as the investigation intensified and media attention grew, he continued to manipulate the situation. He was the one who had hired expensive lawyers for all 4 students, using his family's connections and resources to build an impenetrable wall of legal protection around them. More disturbingly, Mills had documented their crime. Using a digital camera that was state-of-the-art for 2005, he had taken photographs throughout the assault and murder. These images, Johnson revealed, were Mills' insurance policy against his companions ever betraying him. Brandon told us he had pictures of everything, and that if any of us ever talked, he would make sure the police knew exactly who did what. He said he would edit the photos to make it look like one of us was the ringleader while he tried to stop it. We were trapped. The photographs explained the mysterious phone call Patricia Brennan had received during the investigation. Johnson admitted that he had been the caller, working up the courage to reveal the truth, but ultimately losing his nerve when he realized the implications. Mills had threatened to release the photos if Johnson said anything, and the young man had backed down. For 18 years, the 4 men had lived with their secret. Drew Patterson had become a successful attorney in Savannah. Kevin Wright was a doctor in Nashville. Tyler Johnson had worked in finance until his recent downfall, and Brandon Mills had taken over his father's real estate empire in Atlanta. But guilt had taken its toll on all of them except Mills, who seemed to have compartmentalized the crime and moved on with his life as if nothing had happened. Patterson had developed a drinking problem that cost him his first marriage. Wright had refused to have children, haunted by the knowledge of what he had taken from Ashley's parents. Johnson had self-medicated with prescription drugs until addiction destroyed his career and landed him in prison. "I used to have nightmares every night," Johnson confessed. "I would see Ashley's face, hear her voice begging us to let her go. I started drinking to make it stop, then pills when the drinking wasn't enough. I told myself I was suffering enough, and that destroying my own life was somehow justice for what we had done. But it wasn't justice. Justice would be telling the truth." The decision to finally confess had come after Johnson learned that Mills was planning to run for the Georgia State Senate. The idea of his former friend holding public office, making laws and representing citizens while harboring such a dark secret had pushed Johnson past his breaking point. "I couldn't let Brandon become a politician while Ashley was still missing. I couldn't let him profit from our silence anymore. Her parents deserved to know what happened, and Brandon deserved to face the consequences." But Johnson's confession came with a devastating revelation. The limestone cave where they had disposed of Ashley's body had been sealed by the Aruban government in 2009, following several accidents involving inexperienced cavers, like Montes Freeze, Wargaren. A concrete cap had been placed over the opening, making it nearly impossible to recover Ashley's remains without major excavation efforts. Even more heartbreaking, Johnson revealed that the cave system had indeed been connected to underwater channels, just as Mills had predicted. On Hurricane Ivan, which struck Aruba in September 2004, had caused significant flooding in the cave systems. It was possible that Ashley's body had been washed out to sea years ago, making recovery impossible. The confession video concluded with Johnson providing detailed directions to the sealed cave, along with the names and contact information for the other 3 men involved. He also revealed the existence of a safety deposit box in Atlanta where Mills supposedly kept the photographic evidence of their crime. "I know this confession probably won't bring Ashley back or take away your pain," Johnson said directly to the camera, thus speaking to Ashley's parents with tears streaming down his face. "But I hope it gives you some answers, some closure. Ashley was a good person. She was funny and smart and kind, and she didn't deserve what we did to her. I'm sorry it took me 18 years to find the courage to tell you the truth. I'm sorry for everything." The video ended with Johnson staring directly into the camera for several long seconds before reaching out to turn it off. Patricia Brennan sat in stunned silence for several minutes after the confession ended. 17 years of wondering, of hoping, of imagining scenarios where Ashley might still be alive somewhere had been shattered by Tyler Johnson's brutal honesty. Her daughter was dead, had been dead all along. Tremong was crushed and Ikam killed by 4 young men who had never shown a moment's remorse, until one of them faced the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison. The immediate aftermath of receiving the confession was a whirlwind of activity. Patricia contacted the FBI, the Aruban authorities, and the media outlets that had covered Ashley's case over the years. Within hours, the story was breaking on news channels across the country. The 18-year mystery of Ashley Brennan's disappearance had finally been solved. Agent Rebecca Foster, now retired but still following the case, was contacted by her former colleagues and asked to consult on the investigation. Watching Johnson's confession brought back all the frustration she had felt during the original investigation, that when she had known the 4 Georgia students were responsible but couldn't prove it. We were so close, Foster reflected years later. We had all the pieces, but we couldn't put them together without someone on the inside talking. If Johnson had come forward in 2005, we could have recovered Ashley's body, prosecuted all 4 men, and given her parents some measure of justice. The legal ramifications of Johnson's confession were complex. While murder has no statute of limitations, the case would still need to be prosecuted under both Aruban and American law. Johnson's confession was compelling evidence, but it was still the testimony of a convicted felon trying to reduce his own sentence. More importantly, the confession had to be corroborated by physical evidence. The sealed cave would need to be excavated, the photographic evidence located, and the other 3 suspects arrested and interrogated. It would be a massive undertaking requiring cooperation between multiple jurisdictions and significant financial resources. Brandon Mills was arrested at his Atlanta office 3 days after Johnson's confession became public. The sight of the successful real estate developer being led away in handcuffs was broadcast live on local news stations. Mills maintained his innocence, claiming that Johnson was fabricating the entire story to reduce his own prison sentence. Drew Patterson and Kevin Wright were arrested the same day, both at their respective homes. Patterson's arrest was particularly dramatic, occurring during his daughter's 7th birthday party in front of dozens of guests. Wright was taken into custody at the hospital where he worked, creating a sensation among his colleagues and patients. The arrests sent shockwaves through the communities where the 3 men had built their lives. Neighbors, colleagues, and family members struggled to reconcile the respected professionals they knew with the monsters described in Johnson's confession. Mills' wife filed for divorce within a week of his arrest. Patterson's medical practice was suspended pending investigation. Wright's law firm immediately terminated his partnership. The ripple effects of their decades-old crime continued to expand, destroying not just their lives but the lives of everyone connected to them. The search for the photographic evidence Johnson had described led investigators to a downtown Atlanta bank where Mills maintained several safety deposit boxes. What they found there was even more damning than Johnson's confession had suggested. Mills had indeed documented their crime extensively, but he had also kept souvenirs. Ashley's shell bracelet, the one she had bought with her friends during their first day in Aruba, was wrapped in tissue paper alongside dozens of photographs that captured every horrific moment of her final hours. The images were too graphic to be released to the public, but their existence corroborated every detail of Johnson's confession. They also revealed the cold, calculated nature of Mills' participation in Ashley's murder. He hadn't been a drunk college student who got caught up in events beyond his control. He had been a predator who had planned and orchestrated Ashley's death with chilling precision. Even more disturbing was the discovery of other items in Mills' collection. Jewelry, clothing, and photographs suggesting that Ashley might not have been his only victim. The FBI opened investigations into several unsolved disappearances from the areas where Mills had lived and worked over the past 18 years. The excavation of the sealed cave in Aruba began 6 months after Johnson's confession, funded largely by donations from people who had followed Ashley's case over the years. The process was painstaking and dangerous, requiring specialized equipment and expert cave divers to navigate the flooded lower levels. After 2 weeks of careful excavation, searchers finally reached the bottom of the vertical shaft where Ashley's body had been thrown 18 years earlier. What they found there brought both closure and heartbreak to the Brennan family. Ashley's remains were indeed in the cave, but they were incomplete. As Johnson had predicted, Hurricane Ivan's flooding had washed away portions of her skeleton. However, enough remained to confirm her identity through dental records and to corroborate the manner of her death described in the confession. Also found with Ashley's remains were personal items that connected her to the life she had been forced to leave behind. Her high school class ring, a small cross necklace her grandmother had given her, and fragments of the white sundress she had been wearing the night she died. The discovery of Ashley's body finally allowed her parents to lay their daughter to rest. The funeral, held 18 years after her death, was attended by hundreds of people who had followed her case and been touched by her family's long search for answers. David Brennan, now 73 years old and in failing health, struggled through a eulogy that he had been mentally composing for nearly 2 decades. "Ashley was supposed to outlive us," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "She was supposed to have a career, a family, grandchildren for us to spoil. Instead, she became a symbol of a broken system that protects the wealthy and powerful at the expense of justice." In the trial of Brandon Mills, Drew Patterson and Kevin Wright began in the summer of 2024. The prosecution, led by a team of federal attorneys working with Aruban officials, presented a devastating case built on Johnson's confession, the photographic evidence, and testimony from forensic experts who had examined Ashley's remains. The defense strategy focused on attacking Johnson's credibility, arguing that his confession was the desperate lie of a convicted criminal trying to reduce his sentence. They claimed that the photographic evidence had been fabricated or altered, and that their clients were being scapegoated for a crime they didn't commit. But the evidence was overwhelming. Johnson had provided details that only someone present during Ashley's murder could have known. And the photographs, despite their horrific nature, corroborated every aspect of his confession. The physical evidence found with Ashley's remains supported the prosecution's timeline of events. Most damaging to the defense was Mills' own behavior in the years following Ashley's death. Investigators had uncovered evidence of his efforts to monitor the investigation, his attempts to discredit potential witnesses, and his use of private investigators to keep tabs on the Brennan family's activities. The trial lasted 4 months and generated international media coverage. The courtroom was packed daily with reporters, legal experts, and members of the public who had followed the case since Ashley's disappearance. The Brennan family attended every session, finally hearing the complete truth about their daughter's final hours. Tyler Johnson testified for the prosecution via video link from federal prison, providing additional details about the crime and expressing remorse for his role in Ashley's death and the subsequent cover-up. His testimony was emotional and compelling, clearly affecting both the jury and the packed courtroom. The defense's attempts to discredit Johnson fell flat when prosecutors revealed that his decision to confess had actually made his legal situation worse, not better. The additional charges he faced for his role in Ashley's murder would likely extend his prison sentence significantly, undermining the defense's claim that he was lying to gain favorable treatment. Brandon Mills, Drew Patterson, and Kevin Wright were all convicted of first-degree murder, sexual assault, and conspiracy charges. Mills, identified as the ringleader, was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Patterson and Wright each received sentences of 45 years to life, making them eligible for parole only in their 70s. Tyler Johnson, who had cooperated with investigators and testified against his former friends, received a sentence of 25 years to life. His confession had finally brought justice for Ashley Brennan, but it had also ensured that he would spend most of his remaining years behind bars. The convictions brought a measure of closure to the Brennan family, but they couldn't restore the 18 years of uncertainty and grief they had endured. Patricia Brennan, now in her 70s, had dedicated nearly half her life to finding answers about her daughter's fate. "We finally know what happened to Ashley," she said after the verdicts were announced. "We know she didn't suffer for long, and we know she fought until the end. That's something, I suppose. But we also know that 4 young men made a choice to destroy her life and ours, and then spent 18 years lying about it. That's harder to forgive." The Ashley Brennan Foundation, established by her parents during the years of uncertainty, continued its work helping other families navigate the complex international legal systems that often hindered missing person investigations. The foundation had assisted in resolving dozens of cases over the years, turning the family's tragedy into a force for positive change. David Brennan passed away 6 months after the trial ended, finally able to rest knowing that his daughter's killers had been brought to justice. Patricia continued the foundation's work, driven by a determination to ensure that other families wouldn't endure the decades of uncertainty that had defined her life. The case of Ashley Brennan became a cautionary tale about privilege, power, and the lengths to which some people will go to protect their secrets. It highlighted the importance of international cooperation in criminal investigations and the need for reforms in how missing person cases involving Americans abroad are handled. But perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that the truth, no matter how long buried or carefully hidden, has a way of eventually coming to light. Ashley Brennan's voice had finally been heard, 18 years after it was silenced on a remote beach in Paradise. The limestone cave where Ashley's body was discovered has been designated as a memorial site, that with a small plaque honoring her memory and the memory of other victims of violent crime. Visitors to Aruba can now pay their respects to a young woman whose dreams of becoming a journalist were cut short by men who believed their wealth and privilege placed them above the law. Ashley's story serves as a reminder that behind every missing person case is a human being with hopes, dreams, and people who love them. She was more than just a victim or a headline. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. The case also revealed the devastating long-term effects of violent crime, not just on the immediate victims but on families, communities, and society as a whole. The Brennan family's 18-year search for answers cost them their health, their peace of mind, and ultimately their remaining time together as a family. In the end, justice for Ashley Brennan came at a terrible price, paid not just by her killers but by everyone whose lives were touched by their crime. The 4 men who thought they could murder an innocent young woman and escape the consequences learned that some secrets are too heavy to carry forever. Tyler Johnson's decision to finally tell the truth may have been motivated by self-interest, but it ultimately served a greater purpose. Ashley Brennan's family finally had answers, her killers were held accountable, and other families facing similar tragedies had a reminder that hope should never be abandoned entirely. The young woman from Mountain Brook, Alabama, who dreamed of becoming a journalist and telling important stories, had finally had her own story told. It was a story of innocence destroyed, justice delayed, and the unbreakable bonds of family love that sustained a search for truth across nearly 2 decades. Ashley Brennan was 18 years old when she died, but her impact on the world continues to grow. Her name is now synonymous with the fight for justice for victims of violent crime, and her memory serves as inspiration for families who refuse to give up hope, even when faced with seemingly impossible circumstances. The vanishing on Paradise Beach had finally been solved, but the lessons it taught about human nature, justice, and the price of silence would resonate far beyond the shores of Aruba. Ashley Brennan's story was complete, but her legacy was just beginning.